This is a quote from his book. Big pharma needs sick people to prosper. Patients, not healthy people, are their customers. If everybody was cured of a particular illness or disease, pharmaceutical companies would lose 100% of their profits on the products they sell for that ailment. What all this means is because modern medicine is so heavily intertwined with the financial profits culture. It's a sickness industry more than it is a health industry.
It's true. I mean, from a business standpoint, it's just logical. I mean, think back to one of the best case studies that was ever communicated when I was in school was about Kodak. They were the first to invent the technology for the digital camera. But they didn't want to put the digital camera out because they realized, well, if we do this, then we're going to lose our entire film business.
Polaroids.
Yeah, so we don't want to lose the film processing side of our business because it's a huge revenue. So they held on to it. And then, of course, the technology comes out because everybody was working on it, and then bye-bye Kodak.
Does that get you to think of cancer treatments?
Sure. Yeah.
And this is a podcast for the future, but apparently, and I've just started looking into this, there are some treatments that are believed to cure cancer that just are not.
Yeah, there's always stories of those, but if there's one thing I've learned in this room is that the human body is very complex, unique, and we're not the same. Yeah. So I believe that there are some things that work probably very well for some people where it doesn't work for others, and continuing to evolve in that area and come up with some solutions. But if there needs to be, I think, unique solutions based on your genetic profile in terms of like increasing the likelihood of you having a successful outcome.
But the point being, if there is something that exists, then that is not in the best interest of their bottom line. And so now let's think about the psychiatric drug industry.
Okay.
Previously, when I talk about the rarity of psychiatric diagnoses, the ones that would require a drug because of their severity, it's just not enough people for a lucrative industry.
Agree.
So they had to increase the prevalence rate of their conditions. They had to normalize it. And that was where they used academic psychiatry as a way to increase the number of people who can identify with mental illness through hiring them as paid spokespeople and creating ideas around it. And that's where, when you think about how ADHD in itself has risen in prevalence rate, is they created a lot of marketing campaigns that are lies. Like, if you're ADHD and it goes untreated, then you are more likely to experience later mental health problems and substance abuse, when it's exactly the opposite. It is a gateway into the psychiatric industrial complex from multiple perspectives. From one, the idea that you have to turn to a drug in order to feel better primes a young person at a very young age to be placed onto a drug to alter their behaviors and their mood. Secondly, the drugs themselves have significant side effects. Right? This goes back to the difference between drugs and medicine. These are drugs, and the brain adapts to them, always seeking out homeostasis. Once the brain gets used to it, it's not going to have the same effect. You're going to have to increase the dose. Side effects of the drug can create mood dependence, mood problems, anxiety, and a range of other conditions that go beyond the scope of today's discussion. But when you experience those side effects, well, then you're going back to the doctor. It's a cycle that you stay in. And this became much more prevalent in the 90s into the 2000s. And then I started to recall that infamous interview between Matt Lauer and Tom Cruise.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to go back and watch that again. And I did this morning, and we'll play it again for our listeners today. And I wonder how people might think about this from a different lens. Take away Scientology from it, right? You know nothing about Scientology. You take Scientology out of this conversation, and you tell me that Tom Cruise was not way ahead of his time in how he was discussing this.
I've never agreed with psychiatry, ever. Before I was a Scientologist, I never agreed with psychiatry. And then when I started studying the history of psychiatry, I started realizing more and more why I didn't agree with psychiatry. And as far as the Brooke Shields thing is, look, you got to understand, I really care about Brooke Shields. I think here's a wonderful and talented woman. And I want to see her do well. And I know that psychiatry is a pseudoscience.
But Tom, if she said that this particular thing helped her feel better, whether it was the antidepressant or going to a counselor or a psychiatrist, isn't that enough?
Matt, you have to understand this. Here we are today, where I talk out against drugs and psychiatric abuses of electric shocking people, okay, against their will, of drugging children with them not knowing the effects of these drugs. Do you know what Adderall is? Do you know Ritalin? Do you know now that Ritalin is a street drug? Do you understand that?
The difference is this was not against her will, though.
Matt, I'm
asking
you a question. Matt, I'm asking you a question.
I understand there's abuse of all of these things.
No, you see, here's the problem. You don't know the history of psychiatry. I do.
Aren't there examples, and might not Brooke Shields be an example of someone who benefited from one of those drugs?
All it does is mask the problem, Matt. And if you understand the history of it, it masks the problem. That's what it does. That's all it does. You're not getting to the reason why. There is no such thing as a chemical imbalance.
So postpartum depression to you is
Matt,
kind of a little psychological gobbledygook?
No, I did not say that.
I'm just asking what would you call it?
Matt, that is the post. Now you're talking about two different things.
That's what she went on the antidepressant for.
But what happens, the antidepressant, all it does is mask the problem. There's ways of vitamins and through exercise and various things. I'm not saying that that isn't real. That's not what I'm saying. That's an alteration of what I'm saying. I'm saying that drugs aren't the answer, that these drugs are very dangerous. They're mind-altering, antipsychotic drugs. And there are ways of doing it without that so that we don't end up in a brave new world. The thing that I'm saying about Brooke is that there's misinformation, okay? And she doesn't understand the history of psychiatry. She doesn't understand in the same way that you don't understand it, man.
But a little bit what you're saying, Tom, is you say you want people to do well, but you want them to do well by taking the road that you approve of, as opposed to a road that may work for them.
No, I'm not.
Well, if antidepressants work for Brooke Shields, why isn't that okay?
I disagree with it. And I think that there's a higher and better quality of life.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to start. Couple things. At this point, I have no reason to believe that Brooke Shields really went through postpartum depression, went on antidepressants, and it helped her. Because now I know what happened back then. They would hire people who were influential in a particular culture. They would pay for them to say such things. That is a fact. Is it possible she really did go through postpartum depression and she believed an antidepressant helped her? Maybe. I doubt it because antidepressants aren't very effective, or not effective for postpartum depression. Right? It's, logically speaking, we know that a drug that's targeting one neurotransmitter, increasing the availability of serotonin when there's no serotonin deficit in the first place, for something as complex hormonally and environmentally as someone who is struggling with depressed mood following having a child. I mean, that's such a complex issue that needs to be treated with the complexity it deserves. But you throw that out into popular culture, and now you assume you have a medicine. It's correcting something. It's healing. It's a tool, whatever those words that exist. But Tom at least did some examination into like what these drugs actually do. And I've always believed in the scientific method, right? So, prove it, right? It is of the responsibility of those who are putting out the drug to prove its efficacy.
Let's talk about this interview. So the date of this is June of 2005. So
20 years ago.
Almost 20 years, 19 years ago. Do you remember how you felt when you saw this interview for the first time and what was going through your mind?
So I was in my doctoral program.
Okay.
And I remember the discussion distinctly in one of my classrooms.
Were you going? You're getting your master's at the time, or your doctorate?
My doctorate.
Okay.
I was at Philadelphia College of Osteopathic Medicine.
Okay.
And I remember these two, I just remember them as very naive young women.
Okay.
Who knew nothing about antidepressants or psychiatric drugs, and from their work history were never placed in some of the environments that I was placed in.
Okay. Yeah.
And I remember them using ad hominem attacks on Tom Cruise, right? He's like a science denier, he's a Scientologist, almost like you're anti-progress. And that's kind of the view. Like the view at that particular time, the prevailing view was science is progress. And what gets in the way is traditionalism. That sometimes conservative or religious beliefs get in the way of progress. So there was no critical evaluation of safety or efficacy or what we know about the drugs at all. So I was that alternative voice. What do you know about antidepressant drugs other than they're using a marketing term, antidepressant? Well, I know they help people. Well, how do you know that? Well, why would they be prescribed, and why would people say that they help them if that wasn't the case? And I even knew then, I said, well, scientifically, we were studying to be psychologists. I would say, well, scientifically, you would understand why someone may report something to be helping them when it doesn't actually. I just would ask a series of questions. And I said, we're psychologists. We're not psychiatrists. Why do you need to pound the drum for medicines for our mental health? What do we know about that? Where is that helping people? What are alternatives? And I got into that discussion only because of my history in both juvenile probation at the psychiatric hospitalization, where I, saw harms.
Yeah, you had perspective.
I had a different perspective. I to be honest, I didn't dismiss the idea that maybe there was some value. I just didn't accept it as absolute truth.
You questioned it.
Yeah. It was worth questioning.
Yeah.
And, you see then there's all the hit pieces. Like Tom Cruise is crazy.
I remember that. That's what I was thinking.
Yep. He's crazy.
Yeah.
And that's ad hominem attacks. I always have trouble with that.
Yeah.
That's where you're discrediting the person and not the idea.
Yeah.
And that kept a lot of important science out of the mainstream.
But everything that he was saying now, when you look back on it, of, nutrition and exercise.
Yeah. Reasonable.
Those are
the problems of drugging kids.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like
it's weird to look back on that and know how I felt at the time and how I view things now.
Yeah. And that's what's interesting too, is because you see the role of corporate media. We were really only exposed to corporate media. So the Today's Show, which he was on with Matt Lauer, is one of the most popular shows in the entire country. There will never be one show that gets that many viewers anymore, right? Because of how the media landscape has changed.
So fragmented, yeah.
And now you have all these podcasts, and most people are getting entertainment.
Nobody listens to podcasts.
I think, Tucker Carlson on X, when he had the interview with Putin, had millions of views, right? More than what he would ever have gotten on Fox News.
Mm-hmm.
So the landscape is changing. The way people digest content now is just different. And, you get all this fragmented kind of media space, but the use of podcasts, like ours, is you can have these conversations, you can talk to experts. You only were exposed to what they wanted you to hear. And because the pharmaceutical industry began to almost like 60% of their operating budgets, they were paying their salaries. So they become paid spokespeople. And they start using the same terms, like medicine. There's now you're talking about mental health in a different way, and it shapes our culture.